All right, everybody, welcome back to Introduction to U.S. Multicultural Literatures. Today we are going to begin looking at some of the texts I've asked you to read for the course. Last week we talked, or in the last lecture, we talked about the origins and transformations of the word culture and where ideas about culture were at the beginning of the 20th century and how that informed some of the arts of the time. And we also talked about the modernist movement and in all of the arts and some of the characteristics of the modernist movement. And we used a painting by Pablo Picasso to exemplify modernism in the visual arts and by application to all the arts. But now, in this lecture, we now want to get into literature. Specifically, I want to begin talking about poetry, the poetry of the modernist movement in its various forms. Now, before we can look at some poems, and I do want to look in this lecture at some poems by Ezra Pound, by Gertrude Stein, and maybe by Langston Hughes, though if not, we'll talk about Langston Hughes at the beginning of the next lecture. But before we can look at poetry, I just want to have a brief explanation of the elements of poetry. Now, this will probably be a review for most people. I'm sure you learned many of these things, earlier in your education and whatever English classes you might have taken, so I'm not going to spend a very long time on it, but I do want to give you some of the terminology that can be used to analyze poetry, because I will be using this terminology throughout the class, and you might want to use this terminology, especially in your discussion sections and then when you come to write your essay, because one of the essays you're going to write for this course will be about poetry. So you might want to use these terms to be specific in your analysis. So that's the plan for today's lecture. I'm going to go through the elements of poetry, and then I'm going to go through the poems, at least by Pound and Stein, and maybe by Langston Hughes. All right, so what are the basic elements of poetry? To begin thinking about that, we need to think about what makes a poem and how that differs from the other use of written language, which is prose. So prose is what we read every day. Prose is what a news article will be written in. It's what a novel will be written in, or a short story, or an article in a magazine, or a blog post, or a tweet, or whatever. Prose is a form of writing whose basic unit is the sentence. And the sentence can be as long or short as the writer wants it to be, and the sentence will just go from the left side of the page and it'll go to all the way to the right margin of the page. And if the sentence isn't ended yet, the sentence begins again on the next line on the left margin and goes all the way to the right margin, and it just goes that way until you are finished with the sentence, and then another sentence starts. So prose comes in these kinds of blocks of writing or of print. It goes from the left margin to the right margin, and it's organized by the sentence. The way that poetry differs from prose is that the basic unit of poetry is a line. And it's a line that is usually, though not always, shorter than a line of writing or of type. Usually when you look at a poem on the page, each line stops short of the right margin. It stops before it gets to the right margin, and then another line starts below it. So the basic unit of poetry is not the sentence, but the line. Now, how does a poet determine how long the line in a poem should be? Well, it could be a couple different ways. So in traditional poetry, poets will use devices to organize the sounds of their poem. And we're going to talk about that below on my list here. So you'll see meter is under the phrase verse form. So meter is when writers use patterns of stressed and unstressed syllables to determine how long their line should be. So, for instance, you might be familiar with the works of William Shakespeare. You might have studied those in high school. Well, in the works of William Shakespeare, he tended to write poetry in a particular style of verse that demanded that he use a pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables such that every single line of his verse had 10 syllables. And so when he got to 10 syllables in that pattern, he ended the line and started the next one. That was how traditional poetry tended to be written. The poet would choose a pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables that would tell the poet how long, that is, how many syllables each line had to be. In more modern poetry, and we're going to study modern poetry in this class, and we're going to study poets in this class that were the first poets to really say, that's too old-fashioned, we're not going to write that way. What they did was they dispensed with that idea, and they said that the line was however long the poet wanted it to be, based on whatever criteria the poet chose. So where to end a line and begin a new one then became something that was up to the poet, based on some free pattern of rhythm the poet chose, or based on some sound effect that was not linked to traditional verse forms that the poet wanted to create. But in any case, whether you're looking at traditional or modern and contemporary verse, the line is going to be the basic unit of poetry, and generally the line stops before the right margin of the page. Now, there's two kinds of lines in poetry. I know this, by the way, all sounds very technical and abstract. This will only really make sense when we start looking at some poems, if you're not familiar with this, and then you'll see how poets use these ideas. So there's two basic ways to end a line of poetry. They are called the end-stopped line and the enjambed line. So when an end-stopped line, when you see that in a poem, what you will find is that the line of poetry ends where a unit of grammar ends, whether that's a clause or a sentence. So what that means is, the easy way to tell this is if you see a line that ends with a punctuation mark, whether that is a comma, a period, a colon, a semicolon, a question mark, an exclamation point, a punctuation mark means that a unit of grammar, a sentence or a clause, which is a smaller unit within a sentence, has come to an end. And then the next line of poetry will begin another unit of grammar. All right, so the end-stopped line ends where a unit of grammar ends. An enjambed line ends within a grammatical unit. So just to take an example, let's just take a very simple English sentence. She threw the ball. An end-stopped line would have she threw the ball, period. And that would be one line of poetry. And the next line of poetry would begin another sentence. If we did that in an enjambed way, it would say she threw on line 1 and then the ball on line 2. So you see how you have the two lines, but it takes both lines to make up a complete grammatical unit, a complete sentence. Now this is very dry, who cares about grammar? I understand that. I don't care about grammar either. I care about it a little, I'm joking. But the point is, poets can use these techniques to create certain effects. For example, a poem that is written all in enjambment, where each line ends before the sentence is complete, feels very hurried. It feels very urgent. It feels very rushed. You're being carried along through the poem because each line requires you to read the one that follows it to make any sense of it. So it can feel very breathless, very hurried, very rushed. Whereas end-stopped poetry can feel much more formal because each line ends with a kind of clear conclusion. So these seemingly dry and abstract grammatical questions end up being the building blocks of how poets create the feeling that they want their poetry to create and the meaning and the themes they wish to convey. Because if a poem, when you read it, feels very rushed, well, the poet created that effect for a reason and wanted you to feel that emotion for a reason. So there's an emotion created, and then there's an idea that accompanies that emotion that you're supposed to feel. And that is what these poetic techniques and effects lead to, even when it seems like we're just talking about something very dull like grammar. So that's that. So the basic unit of poetry is the line, and lines can be end-stopped or enjambed. Now, let's talk about verse form. I already began to discuss this. So verse form refers to how the language of a poem is organized by sound. So I already referred to the idea of meter. Traditional poetry, at least in the English language, I won't necessarily comment on how this works in other languages, but traditional poetry in the English language was organized by meter or by metrical patterns. The word meter comes from the same word for measure. So what writers would do is that they would choose a pre-established pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables, and then they would write a poem within that pattern. So let me just go back again to William Shakespeare, because I know this is a poet that is studied in American high school, so I know that most of you will have encountered his work. He wrote in a verse form called iambic pentameter. And what that meant was that an iamb is a unit of poetry that is an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. So one unstressed syllable followed by one stressed syllable. And pentameter meant that he would, in each poetic line, include 5 iambs. So 5 units of a stressed syllable followed by an unstressed syllable. So what does this mean? This means that each of his lines had to have 10 syllables in a pattern of an unstressed followed by a stressed. And he would sometimes throw on an extra unstressed at the end. He liked to do that. So what's the most famous line in all of William Shakespeare's plays? It's when Hamlet says, "To be or not to be, that is the question." So I just said it very naturally, but what if we really broke that down into syllables? To be or not to be, that is the question. See how he threw the unstressed one at the end? But did you hear how everything before that 11th syllable was in a pattern of unstressed syllables followed by stressed? To be or not to be. So that's meter. Now, meter is probably the most intimidating aspect of poetry because it can be hard to figure out what the meter of a poem is, and it's hard to memorize all the different verse forms that there are. And it's not even really taught that much anymore, even in English classes. Why is it not taught that much anymore? Well, because at the beginning of the 20th century, for reasons we're about to discuss when we look at Ezra Pound, Gertrude Stein, and Langston Hughes, modernist poets said, let's not worry about this so much, or at least let's not worry about it in its traditional form. I do assure you that modernist poets were still paying attention to the rhythm of their language and thought that was very important. But they said, let's get rid of this idea that every poem needs to be written in this very regular and pre-established grid of stressed and unstressed syllables. Okay, but that's the first way you can organize the language of your poem by sound. The second way is through rhyme. Rhyme is the regular matching of sounds, particularly the sounds of the ends of words in a poem. And that typically occurs at the end of a line. So, I don't know. She threw the ball. It hit the wall. So ball and wall rhyme. Generally, the basic criterion for a rhyme is that the last vowel and the last consonant sound that you hear in a word, in two different words, have to be the same. So ball, wall. She threw the ball, it hit the wall. It scared us all. Um, so yeah, I could go on. I actually couldn't go on. But the point is, rhymes are when you have those matching sound patterns. Now, they're usually at the ends of lines. Sometimes they can be in the middle of lines. There is something called interior rhyme or internal rhyme. So that's rhyme. Now, again, traditional poetry in the English language tended to have regular pre-established rhyme schemes. So if you were a poet, you would choose a rhyme scheme before you even wrote your poem. You would say, I'm going to choose to write so that every pair of lines has a rhyme at the end. Or I'm going to choose to write in a form of poetry where every other line will rhyme with the one before it. And so all the, let's say, all the even numbered lines will rhyme and all the odd numbered lines will rhyme, etc. So you would get very regular rhyme schemes, just as you would get very regular metrical schemes. So, writing poetry before the beginning of the 20th century almost always involved this process of choosing a meter and a rhyme scheme and then fitting your words into that grid of organization by sound. Now, what happens at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century? What happens is that something called free verse becomes much more popular. And in fact, often considered one of our most important American poets, Walt Whitman, was one of the first poets to really make free verse the center of how he wrote poetry. And he was a big influence certainly on Ezra Pound and on Langston Hughes. Well, Ezra Pound denied it, but he was lying. But Langston Hughes admitted it. But he was a big influence on them and on a lot of 20th century poets. What Walt Whitman did was he wrote poetry that did not have a pre-established pattern of meter or rhyme. So that's what free verse means. Poetry written without this pre-established pattern of meter or rhyme. And this was controversial when it first, started happening. People said this is lazy. This is, I think it was another famous American poet, Robert Frost, said it's like playing tennis without a net. So this was criticized. But nevertheless, I think if you study the work of poets who write free verse, whether that be Walt Whitman or Ezra Pound or Langston Hughes, you will find that they're actually paying very close and careful attention to the language they're using, and they're choosing their words very deliberately. And often they are using rhyme, and often they are using deliberate patterns of rhythm, but they're not doing it in some traditional or pre-established way. Now, why did this change take place? That's something we could talk about for a long time. There's a number of different causes. One of the causes we're going to talk about in Ezra Pound's case, and in the case of a lot of writers of his generation, is that for the first time, English language poetry was opened up to certain global influences, particularly Chinese and Japanese poetry, and they were starting to sort of try to imitate that in ways that didn't lend itself to traditional ways of writing English poetry. So that's one reason, and we'll see that very clearly with Ezra Pound. Another reason might sound more philosophical or abstract, but another reason is that it has a lot to do with what we talked about with the changing definitions of culture in the last lecture. That just as we saw thinkers like Darwin and Nietzsche and Freud and Boas, and we saw in disciplines from biology to anthropology to physics, we saw a series of developments, intellectual developments, that called into question the way that people had taken for granted that the world was organized. It called into question all these hierarchies. So just as culture could no longer be thought of as the best that has been thought and said, but began to be thought of as just the practices of any given people, so it began to seem odd to write poetry in a way that was so traditional and so formally and rigidly organized, as if to suggest in its very form that there was some natural hierarchy in the world. And so those Darwinian and Freudian and Einsteinian developments that called an elitist and hierarchical vision of culture into question also called into question traditional ways of doing the arts. So that's verse form and some of the transformations in verse form that have happened at the beginning of the 20th century, which is where we'll begin our course. The next three things I'm going to go through much more quickly. They're much more simple. So the next thing I want to look at is the idea of a stanza. So a stanza is a unit of lines within a poem that is kind of separated from the other units of lines. This is just like when you read prose, and there's a new paragraph start. So there'll be an indentation in prose, and there's a new paragraph, and you'll read down to the next indentation, and that's a paragraph. A stanza can be thought of as the poetry equivalent of a paragraph. And it'll be easy to see when you look at a poem. There'll be, let's say, 4 lines grouped together, single spaced. Then there'll be a double space, a white space. And then there'll be another 4 lines grouped together, single spaced. Then there'll be a double space, etc. So those are stanzas. I'm sure you already heard that in your education. So let me move on to this idea. So this is a convention that has developed in literary criticism, particularly over the last 100 years. The idea is that we need a word for the sort of voice you hear in a poem. Poetry often, we're going to talk about point of view when we start talking about fiction, but just briefly, poetry is often written in the first person point of view. It often has this I voice, this capital I, that speaks. And sometimes poetry is very autobiographical. And so the I seems to be the voice of the poet, conveying the poet's experience. However, and we're going to see this later in the course, we're even going to learn a term later in the course for a form of poetry in which it's not at all autobiographical. You hear an I, but that I is a character the poet has created. So I think what literary critics have thought, and this is sort of filtered into the way that poetry is taught today, is that we should let's just be on the safe side and treat every voice, every poem you read, even if it seems autobiographical, even if it's spoken from the position of the I, we want to talk about how each poem has a speaker. And the speaker of a poem is just like the narrator of a story. It's the person telling the story. And just as in fiction, the narrator is a fictional creation, even when the fiction is autobiographical, so we want to think about the speaker of the poem, the character who utters the poem, as a kind of character created by the poet. Because a poem is a highly artificial, form of art. So even if the poet is writing autobiographically, that poet is still very ruthlessly condensing and selecting what will be presented and what will be left out of that experience that is being recalled. So even if, let's say, Ezra Pound or Walt Whitman, even if they're writing about themselves, they're still kind of constructing themselves as a fictional character. So you always want to talk about the speaker of the poem. Why do we use this term speaker? Why don't we just say narrator? I don't actually know. I think it comes from the idea that poetry ultimately is a very, very ancient form of art. It's probably one of the oldest forms of human art. But in its early days, it was oral. It was a spoken form, and it only became written and then printed later. So I think we use the term speaker in tribute to this idea of the orality of poetry. All right, and then finally, we want to talk about something that this is also applicable to fiction as well as to poetry. Often writers will use figurative language to make their writing more vivid. Figurative language is the use of figures, or tropes is a common term for it, which is, let's look at this word trope for a minute. So, this word trope, when it's applied in literature, is the exact same root as a word I'm sure you encountered in your science classes. So, you probably in your science classes, I don't know anything about science, but let's just pretend for a minute. I think in your science classes you learned about how a plant, if you put it by the window, the plant will grow toward the sun. And you probably learned that the Greek phrase for that is heliotropism. And helio in Greek, or helios, means the sun, and trope in Greek means to turn. So the plant turns toward the sun. So in the discipline of literary criticism, trope, that's the same word. It means turn. What it means in literary criticism is when you see a use of language that turns away from the literal, that does not mean what it seems to literally mean. And there are many different types of figurative language. I could give you a list. It would be a very long list of hyperbole and metonymy and synecdoche. For some reason, everything's in Greek. We could talk about why that is, but it's all Greek. But I don't want to. This is an introductory course. This is not a sort of master's PhD level course. So I don't think I want to make you responsible for all of those terms. What I would like you to think about is the most common form of figurative language, which is metaphor. A metaphor is when the writer compares two unlike things to suggest a likeness between them, to somehow make it more vivid to the reader. And then a simile is a metaphor that's introduced with the words like or as. So I'll give you an example. I'm sitting in a room here, and the room has white walls. So here's a simile. The wall is as white as snow. So we could think about all the differences between the wall and snow. You know, snow is cold, the wall is room temperature, snow is outside, the wall is inside, etc. But what I'm trying to do is compare them along one line of similarity, which is their color. And so I compare two unlike things to suggest a likeness. Or really, I compare one thing that I'm mainly talking about, the wall, to something else to suggest a similarity, to bring a feature of the thing I'm talking about to life. So a simile explicitly introduces the comparison. The wall is as white as snow. The wall is like snow. With a metaphor, it's more implied. You don't use that like or as. You make the comparison more directly and let the reader infer that it is a comparison. So I might say, if I wanted to do a metaphor, I might say the snow white wall, okay? Or the snow of the wall's whiteness, or something. This is all very bad poetry I'm giving you for examples. I'm just making this stuff up. But you see what I mean. A metaphor is when you take something and you compare it to something that is in most ways different from it, but is in at least one or two important ways similar. And that similarity makes the thing you're talking about more vivid. And a simile is that with like or as. I hope that's clear. I hope this list has been clear to you. Keep in mind, there's not, while there is kind of going to be an exam in this course, there's not going to be an exam where I ask you to memorize. I'm not going to ever give you a quiz on this where I ask you to memorize these things. This is just for your information. And I think that these terms will become clearer to you as we read poetry all semester and we see how they apply to different poems. But I do think that you should at least be aware of these terms and maybe revisit this lesson when you're writing your paper on poetry, so that you can use these words that literary critics use as well. All right, so let me move on. Let's now begin reading a poem. Let's start the course by reading a poem. So I decided to start the course with a poem by Ezra Pound called In a Station of the Metro. The main reason I chose to begin the course with this poem is simply for I didn't really choose it for any particular reason intrinsic to this poem. I chose it because the last thing we're reading in this course is a novel called Faces in the Crowd. And the title of the novel comes from a line in this poem. And in the novel, the narrator discusses Ezra Pound. So I thought, well, that would be a nice way to end the course by coming full circle back to the beginning. So I chose the beginning with the ending in mind. I also chose it because it's an interesting kind of case study in a certain form of multiculturalism. It's not the form of multiculturalism we're mainly going to be exploring in this class. Most of this class, the type of multiculturalism we will be exploring is the writing from cultures that have been in some way oppressed or marginalized by a dominant culture, and the writers are writing on behalf of those cultures. Okay? Ezra Pound is very different. Ezra Pound, and here we might actually compare him to Pablo Picasso in the field of painting, and these two knew each other, and Ezra Pound plays a similar role in the history of poetry that Picasso plays in the history of painting. Here we have writers who do belong, I think, to that dominant culture, but sought and popularized influences from outside that culture. And just as we said with Picasso, we could talk about whether or not this constitutes a welcome broadening of the cultures of, let's say, European painting or American poetry, or if it constitutes a self-aggrandizing form of cultural appropriation. Critics have argued about this and are still arguing about this, and you can find arguments on both sides. And often, I think this is important to say, arguments from both sides written from writers from the cultures that Picasso and Pound were borrowing from. But nevertheless, it needs to be said that this was a form of multiculturalism that was very influential in the modernist era. So who was Ezra Pound? What were his... Sorry if you can hear the siren outside my window. I can't do anything about that. But who was Ezra Pound, and what is the background to this poem? So Ezra Pound lived from 1885 to 1972. He's a very, very controversial figure who lived a very controversial life. He was born in Idaho to parents of English descent, and at least I think on his mother's side of Quaker descent. So he was educated early on in Quaker schools, and we could maybe talk about a Quaker influence on some of his aesthetic priorities, but that's beyond our scope of this course. Then he went briefly to a military academy, and then he attended the University of Pennsylvania. However, Pound was very unsatisfied in many ways by American culture. He thought that it was too crassly commercial and didn't properly value the arts. And so he left the United States for Europe in 1908, and he lived in London for 12 years. And again, just as with that list of poetry terms on the last slide, you don't need to memorize this. I'm just telling you this for your information and to set the scene. So when he was in London, he was a very ambitious young poet, and he really liked to always be at the center of artistic movements. So he would always go from artistic movement to artistic movement and would create sort of manifestos for different movements, and always kind of, he put himself at the center, though he was also renowned for his generosity, because poets and artists are often, let's say, not the most prosperous people. It's often not the most prosperous career path. So Ezra Pound was renowned for always being there to help you out with some money, or try to get you a grant, or you know, even like really basic stuff. Like he bought a famous modernist author a new pair of shoes. You know, he paid another one's medical bills. So he was very generous, even as he was also kind of a very arrogant young man. And while he was in London, he was introduced to East Asian, to Chinese and Japanese art and poetry. And this influenced one of the first, and I would say probably most influential avant-garde school of poetry he was associated with, which was called Imagism, or in French, Imagism, just the same word with an E on the end and pronounced differently. And we'll talk about the tenets of Imagism in a moment, but let me just finish his terrible biography. So after so what happens in the 19 teens is World War One. World War One is a catastrophic event in the history of Western culture. It calls so many of the assumptions of peace and progress, and so many of the assurances of cultural supremacy that Europe had into question, because it's this pointless, um, this pointless slaughter, and it's extremely brutally violent because it's the first war in which certain new technologies, weapons technologies, are introduced, and so it's just this terrible, terrible event, and for no discernible moral reason. It seems to happen just out of the rivalry of these European powers with no real moral behind it. And Pound, like so many people of his generation, he didn't go to the war, but his friends did, and he lost friends in the war, and this just sort of shattered his faith in Western civilization and in the political forms of England and the United States, such as liberal democracy and capitalism. And this is going to be a theme among the modernists. He began to think that a different form of political order was necessary. So he moves to Italy and he embraces fascism. And along with that, later on, he embraces a virulent form of anti Semitism as well. And during World War II, he broadcast propaganda for the fascist regime of Italy and for the Axis powers on Italian radio. And you can look up this hateful rhetoric. You can find it on the internet. And after the war, he was captured, and he was captured by the Americans, and there was some question about what to do with him. Some people said he should just be summarily executed for treason. However, it was eventually determined that he was insane. And so he was kept in a mental hospital for many years, for almost 15 years after the war in the United States. And then he was released in 1958 and then went back to Italy. And he lived until 1972. And his reputation after the war was a very complicated thing, because many people... So it's undeniable that he was the most influential poet of the modernist period. And a lot of people went to visit him in the mental hospital to pay tribute to him. A lot of poets, including poets like, for instance, Allen Ginsberg, who we won't be reading in this course, but you might have heard of him, who was himself a Jewish man and a gay man. And Pound himself later took back some of the anti-Semitism. He said he was wrong to have adopted this prejudice. And there was a lot of questions about whether his work should be published, whether it should be given awards after the war. And a number of poets took different stances. One poet, W.H. Auden, said that there was a publisher that he was affiliated with that was not going to publish one of Pound's poems because Pound had adopted fascism, and Auden, who was totally anti-fascist, had never been on the side of the fascists. He was a gay man, and so he was part of a marginalized group targeted by the fascists. He said that he would not allow his own work to be published by this publisher if they would censor Pound, because for him it was a free speech issue. And he even said they probably should have shot Pound after the war, but that, given that Pound was alive, he could not stand for the censorship of poetry. So these are questions that, just terrible ethical questions that different people have wrestled with in different ways. So I don't mean to give a big digression, but this is one example of and we're going to see more examples throughout this course of writers who took very controversial positions, sometimes very hateful positions, positions that were later judged totally wrong, and we have to, figure out what we're going to do with their work, especially it's not a question if their work was never good or if their work never had any influence. The question is, what do you do with somebody who wrote important work but also had these problems, these terrible problems? So Pound is a maybe one of the most prominent examples in the 20th century of that. We're going to read a poem that came long before he adopted fascism or any of these issues. We're going to read one of his early poems, and it's generally, one thing that should be said about Pound is it's generally his early poetry that is influential, not the later stuff he wrote under the influence of fascism. So this is one of his most famous poems. It's fairly remarkable for a poet to have one of his most famous poems be only 2 lines long, but that's one of the reasons it's so famous, is because it's I'll explain in a moment. So when Ezra Pound was writing in a station of the Metro just before World War I, he was involved in a school of poetry called Imagism. And I've quoted here from the introduction to the Penguin Anthology of 20th Century American Poetry, in which Rita Dove, the poet who writes the introduction, summarizes or quotes Pound talking about Imagism. Pound says, here are the rules of Imagist poetry. Direct treatment of the thing, whether subjective or objective. So in other words, just describe what you're talking about. So it might help if you knew something about poetry before Ezra Pound came along, but you might not. But poetry was often very very flowery, very metaphorical, very allusive, that is referring back to like Greek and Roman mythology and things like that. And Pound says, why don't we just cut all this stuff out and just directly show us what you're writing about? And going along with that, use absolutely no word that does not contribute to the presentation. Do not add words just to fit a pre-established rhyme scheme or meter pattern. Don't do that. Don't bother with that. It's superfluous. It's wordy. It gets in the way of making a direct impression on the reader. And then, regarding rhythm, compose in the sequence of the musical phrase, not in the sequence of a metronome. So a metronome is a device that musicians use to help them keep rhythm, and it goes back and forth, back and forth. It's kind of like tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. And what Pound's talking about is that that's what traditional meter sounds like. To be or not to be. Tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. You hear that? So he says, get rid of that. It's boring. It's dull. It just gets in the way of directly and concisely giving us the image you want us to see as a poet. So one of the things Pound is extremely influential at doing is urging poets to cut out everything that doesn't matter, to bring things down to the most basic form that you can get them in. And in doing this, he was extremely influenced by Japanese and Chinese aesthetics, particularly by haiku, Japanese haiku poetry, which was just then starting, I think, in the 1900s, or maybe a little earlier in the 1890s, which was only just then becoming introduced into the English language. Because remember, in the history of Japan had undertaken an isolationist policy until the middle of the 19th century, and had been in many ways very closed off to the outside world. And then when Japan opens back up and takes up a more internationalist policy, its culture again becomes more influential than it had been before. So Pound is reading Japanese haiku. He's also reading Chinese poetry, particularly like classical Chinese poetry of the Tang dynasty, like the poems of most famously Li Bai. And he's also looking at the visual art. So I have here on this slide one of the things he said, he was he was inspired to write this poem by this Japanese print by Suzuki Haranobu from the 18th century called Woman Admiring Plum Blossoms at Night. And he said he was inspired to write the poem by this print, but he was also inspired, the subject of the poem is the Paris Metro. So let's talk about that. So the Paris Metro is this underground subway system in Paris that was first built in I think the early 20th, maybe the late 19th century. And you can see a photo of it there. And this was an extremely modern technological development. It was one of the many ultra-modern technological developments that characterizes the early 20th century, that constituted, I think, a series of shocks to people who lived at that time, and that was one of the reasons the way people were writing literature and painting paintings were changing. So you have this very ultra-modern development. And then you have this old 18th century painting and these old poems, these haiku or Tang Dynasty Chinese poems that Pound is reading. So you have two different streams of influence. You have these modern developments and you have these traditional aesthetics. And moreover, you have these modern developments from Europe and you have these traditional aesthetics from Asia, which are influencing an American poet. So you see the confluence of time periods and of cultures here in this poem. So what is the poem? The poem is called In a Station of the Metro. Let's just read it real quick. What I have there is how it looked in its first printing. And what you might have seen if you read it in our anthology or looked it up has a slightly different format. So the words are all the same, but when he first published it, he was experimenting with putting spaces between the words to suggest how it should be read. And then I think he decided that was too much of a gimmick. He also changed the colon to a semicolon for reasons I might discuss in a moment. Let's just read the poem. In a station of the metro, the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. So let's notice a few things about this poem. Number one, I think the first thing to notice is you don't understand the poem without the title. It's the title of the poem that tells you where it is set. It is set at a metro station. And once you know that, you then know what the poem describes, which is, so this is an underground train station. So especially, over 100 years ago where they didn't have as much electrical light, it would have been dark in there. So what he's seeing is people getting on and off the train, and he sees their faces, because he's in Europe, so he's mostly looking at white people. So he sees their pale white faces floating against this dark background. And that's what the poem is about. But the interesting thing about the poem, aside from how short it is, it was not in any way usual for English language poems to be this short. So this is a very short poem, and that itself is a radical gesture. And I think Pound said he originally wrote a 300-line poem on this subject and then struck out everything after the first 2 lines, and that's how he got this poem. So you see this idea of the art of concision. All right. In a station of the metro, the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. So the first thing to notice about the rhythm and the rhyme is this. Is there a regular meter that is traditional to the English language? I can't find one. Here's what I do hear, though. In a station of the metro, the apparition of these faces in the crowd. What I hear is the rhythm of a train. If you've ever been on a train, it goes along the track, then it crosses where 2 tracks meet, and there's a little click. So if you've ever been on a train, here's what it sounds like. In a station of the metro, the apparition of these faces in the crowd. Do you hear how the rhythm of the poem sounds like a train? He takes, instead of a traditional meter he took from the past, and just applied to his subject matter without thinking about it, he comes up with a completely unique rhythm that is perfectly appropriate to his subject matter. Then the next thing, does this poem rhyme? Sort of. So crowd and bow. That's what poets sometimes call, there's a variety of terms for this. It's sometimes called slant rhyme or off rhyme or half rhyme. So to have a complete rhyme, you need the final vowel and the final consonant sound of two words to be the same. What a slant rhyme or an off rhyme or a half rhyme does is it just gives you the final, usually vowel. So crowd, bow. Now, if it were bowed, that's not really a word, I guess as the past tense of bow, then crowd and bowed would be a full rhyme. But crowd and bow is a half rhyme, a slant rhyme. So that gives you the suggestion of a rhyme without completing it. What else should we notice about this poem? There are, I would say, two metaphors. The first is apparition. Apparition is usually used to describe a ghost. A ghost is often described as an apparition. So he's comparing the faces in the crowd of living people to the faces of ghosts. And so we might say that is a very sort of grim metaphor, that the world of the modern sort of turns us into ghosts. We're all living underground in this, subway tunnel, like dead people in Homer's epics who live in the underworld. So that metaphor makes the poem seem kind of unpleasant. And there were a lot of writers, including Ezra Pound's friend, a poet even more famous than him, T.S. Eliot, who did regard the modern world in this way, as something that was rendering us dead, zombie-like, etc. But then there's a second metaphor, which is where he compares the faces in the crowd to petals on a wet black bough. So again, it's just what you see in the print by Harinobu, which is we have this dark background and we have these beautiful flowers kind of opening against the dark background. And that does two things. That turns the image of the people coming in and going out of the subway, that very modern image, into something very beautiful, very serene. Flowers are, I think, traditionally in Western and Eastern culture, are symbols of beauty and of the glories of nature. So that turns the image into something very positive. I think it also does something else. Just as Pound is inspired by these older Chinese and Japanese aesthetics in describing this very modern scene, he's now applying natural imagery of nature, imagery of the countryside, to a very urban technological scene. And I think what he's doing there is that he is trying to show the beauty of the modern and the technological by showing that it has something in common with the beauty of the ancient and the natural. He's combining these domains of the old, the new, the country, the city, nature, technology. He's putting them together to show, I think, a certain beauty in the modern world. And then I think there's a final thing we should notice about this poem before I move on. I could, by the way, talk about this poem for an hour. I've taught classes that were just an hour on this poem. So that's how much he puts into 2 lines. Let's talk about that mark of punctuation that separates the first from the second line. So grammatically, this poem is grammatically incorrect in the following way. It's a sentence with no verb. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. Now you could put a verb in. The apparition of these faces in the crowd is like, or are like, petals on a wet black bough. But he leaves that out. I think he was sort of trying to create a certain serenity by removing the idea of action from the poem. There is no action. And that, we might say, is also part of the influence of of East Asian poetics, because in Western poetics, as Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, wrote the first book on Western poetry called the Poetics, and in it he says poetry is an imitation of an action. And Ezra Pound says that's not. If you read a lot of haiku, you'll see there's really just the perception of nature happening. There's not a lot of action happening. So he literalizes the removal of action by removing the grammatical unit that signals action, which is the verb. And he replaces it with, in this, a colon. And a colon often says directly that what follows the colon has everything to do with what came before it. When he revised this poem, he replaced the colon with a semicolon. And I think he did that because the connection between what comes before and what comes after a semicolon is much more ambiguous. It's just a mark of really juxtaposition. Here's something, and here's something related, but you figure out how. Whereas a colon says, here's something directly related. So removing the colon and introducing a semicolon makes the whole thing even more kind of, let's say, contemplative rather than in any way active. He just lets the two images sit next to each other. Okay? So that's in a station of the metro, and that's one version of how multiculturalism. And you'll notice, by the way, Pound leaves America for Europe. Why? Because he doesn't think America has enough culture. It's just this crassly commercial capitalist culture that doesn't value poetry or art. So in one way, he believes in the ideal of culture as something hierarchical and maybe also elitist. But what he doesn't believe in is in the superiority of European culture to other cultures. He's very willing to open up European aesthetics and say, hey, we should be influenced by Chinese and Japanese aesthetics. They do it better, or at least they do it, if not, I don't think he really thought in those terms, but they do it, in a way that we could benefit from learning. We could invigorate our own perspective by learning from their perspective. So he does have an ideal that I would say is incipiently, nascently, what's a simple word for this? That is the beginnings of multiculturalism. All right, that's Ezra Pound. This is taking longer than I thought, but that's okay. We have plenty of time. I want to turn next, excuse me, to Gertrude Stein. So Gertrude Stein was another modernist writer. She knew Pound. She didn't like Pound. She was famous for a lot of one-liners, a lot of witticisms. And her famous witticism or one-liner about Pound is she said, Pound was the village explainer. Good if you were a village, if not, not. So what that means is that he, as we just saw, was very full of theories and very full of ideas and was going to tell you about them whether you wanted to hear them or not. And she mostly didn't. She was very full of her own theories and ideas, so she didn't care for Ezra Pound. So who was Gertrude Stein? She was an American poet born in my wonderful hometown of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, though she was raised in Oakland, California. Another one of her famous witticisms is, of Oakland, California, she said, there's no there. In other words, it's a very colorless sort of place. It's a very boring place to be. There's no there. So she was born to a fairly upper class family of Jewish background. And being upper class, she did spend some of her childhood in Europe. So like Pound, she had a European connection. She attended college at Radcliffe, which was, so remember, this is a long time ago. So we're talking in the late 19th century. This was before Harvard University admitted female students. So instead, there was Radcliffe, which was essentially Harvard's school specifically for female students. So yes, that doesn't happen anymore, thankfully, but that was the situation back then. But nevertheless, Radcliffe was extremely prestigious, and one of her professors was a famous American philosopher named William James, and I'm going to return to him in a minute. And she briefly went to Johns Hopkins Medical School because William James, I said he was a philosopher, but he's also a psychologist. And I think that was actually the discipline in which he taught at Radcliffe was psychology, which was a very new field at the time. And so he was her professor and he encouraged her to go to med school. The famous anecdote about them was when, and I only tell you this to warn you not to do this, but he gave the final exam one day, and it was, it was a spring day, the end of spring semester, and she wrote a note saying, "It's such a nice day, I don't feel like taking the final exam." And he just let her pass because she was so brilliant. But don't you do that, by the way. But that was the famous story of Gertrude Stein and William James. So anyway, she went for a few years to medical school, but that didn't last very long. And she moves to Paris with her brother, Leo. And her brother was an art collector. And they began collecting all the paintings of the modernist movement. And she became great friends with all the modernist painters of Europe, particularly Picasso. And this is the most famous painting of Stein by Picasso. And he had a good one-liner where somebody said, "That doesn't look like Gertrude Stein." And Picasso said, "It will." Which, when I tell these stories in person and the students never laugh and I don't know if it's my fault or if it's Picasso and Gertrude Stein's fault, I think he meant by that his visionary power was such that everyone would accept his vision as true eventually, is I think the point of that anecdote. But anyway, so she met all the famous painters of the time as well as all the famous writers, particularly. So she situates herself in Paris at her famous address 27 Rue de Fleury, like the street of flowers. And she holds a salon, which is this salon is how it's spelled, Salon, which is where different poets and painters come and congregate. And by this time she had met her life partner, Alice B. Toklas. And so Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas is one of the great romances, one of the great love stories of 20th century literature. And so they set up and they have this salon, and Stein is hosting dinners where Pound and Picasso and Hemingway are attending. And she is also at this time writing a great deal of avant-garde literature, avant-garde fiction and poetry. She wrote in a way that you might call it automatic writing. She wrote very quickly. I think the story, this is probably slightly mythical, I don't know if this is literally true, but the story is that she would just write a page and she'd drop it on the floor. And she'd write another page and she'd drop it on the floor. And Alice B. Toklas, would come and collect them and put them in order. One of the sort of things people always say about them is that though they had a lesbian relationship, in many ways it was very traditionally quote unquote patriarchal. That Gertrude Stein, who said, she always said, "I'm a genius, I'm a great genius," she sort of was this very imperious figure who sort of expected Alice to serve in this almost housewife-like role to her. So there have been many studies of their relationship and what that means and if that's problematic, and we can think about that. But anyway, she wrote very avant-garde literature, and she didn't become a popular success until she wrote a book with the amusing paradoxical title, The Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas. So you're thinking, how can somebody write somebody else's autobiography? Well, what she did was she wrote a book in the voice of her partner, Alice B. Toklas. But the reason it became famous is because it was about Alice B. Toklas going to Paris, meeting Gertrude Stein, and then hosting these salons and meeting Picasso and Matisse and Hemingway and Pound and all these people. So that was her first popular success. And then after that, she became a popular writer, despite the fact that her work is often very difficult to understand and to interpret, for reasons we'll discuss. All right, now Gertrude Stein, just like Ezra Pound, runs into political trouble in ways that critics have only just now started, I think, to appreciate. So Gertrude Stein, so one of the things we're going to talk about in this course is this idea, and we're going to talk about this term extensively later in the course, is identity politics. is your politics based on various characteristics you have, your race, your gender, your sexuality. And so I think for a lot of years, critics who admired Gertrude Stein just naturally, in certain ways, assumed that she would have been a progressive because she was female, she was queer, she was Jewish. But it really wasn't the case. What biographers began to reveal was that she was always extremely conservative. She herself had sympathies with fascism. And then, most controversially, when France was occupied during World War II, she and Alice were able to still live there in the French countryside, and they lived there partially by making friends with an officer who was himself essentially a Nazi. And different critics have argued this different ways. Some people have said she did what she had to do to survive. They did what they had to do to survive. Other critics have taken a much harsher line and described her as a collaborator with Nazism. And that has affected how people have read her work. Some people have said, well, her work is very progressive, it's very emancipatory, it voices this female queer subjectivity that you don't find in patriarchal heterosexual writing. Some critics have said that. Other critics have looked at ways in which her writing might be complicit with fascism. So, like Pound, to a much lesser degree, I should say, but similar to Pound, we have this question: the author's life, the author's political beliefs. How do they affect how we think about the work? How do they affect how we think about politics, identity politics, and all of these issues? I will tell you that the poem we're reading, Just Like in a Station of the Metro, is a very early work. It's Just Like in a Station of the Metro. It's from 1913. And so I think it kind of predates some of these questions that became much more important when fascism was a force in the years leading up to and including World War II. And this is a poem that's hard to understand, but I am going to take this position that this poem is about voicing and uttering a form of female desire and female sexuality that is meant to be different from the ways that texts of male desire and male sexuality were written. So the poem, and I'm coming up here, I think I might just be over an hour. So here's what I think I'm going to do. I think I'm actually going to end. On a suspenseful note. I'm going to read you the poem, and then I'm going to say, I want you to think about this. You think about this poem, and then I'm going to pick right up where I left off in the next lecture by telling you what I think the poem is about. So let me read you the poem. So this poem is called Susie Asado, and it's from 1913. And just to give you a little bit of background, you might be wondering who is Susie Asado. You're certainly not informed in the poem who she is. Well, Susie Asado was a poem about a flamenco dancer that Gertrude Stein had seen in Spain. Possibly, I don't know if this is true, but just for the legend's sake, let's say she was with Picasso and she saw this flamenco dancer in Spain. What is flamenco dance? Flamenco is a style of music and dance based on Spanish folk culture. So based on the kind of traditional popular cultures that you would find, particularly in like the rural and small town areas of Spain. So again, we have just as Picasso is interested, so is Stein interested, in folk cultures and folk traditions. So it's a poem written about, or maybe even to, a Spanish dancer. And the image on the slide there is just of a flamenco dancer from the early 20th century. That's not Susie Asado. I don't know if there is a picture of Susie Asado. So let me read you the poem. Susie Asado. Sweet, 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 sweet tea. Susie Asado. Sweet, 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 sweet tea. Susie Asado. Susie Asado, which is a told tray sure. A lean on the shoe, this means slips hers. When the ancient light gray is clean, it is yellow, it is a silver cellar. This is a please, this is a please, there are the seds to jelly. These are the wets, these say the sets, to leave a crown to inky. Inky is short for incubus. A pot. A pot is a beginning of a rare bit of trees. Trees tremble. The old vats are in baubles, baubles which shade and shove and render clean must. Drink pups, drink pups, drink pups, lease a sash hold, see it shine, and a bobolink has pins. It shows a nail. What is a nail? A nail is unison. Sweet, 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 sweet tea. All right. So what's that all about? I think you should think about what it's about, and just think about what it's about, and I'll tell you what I think it's about at the beginning of the next lecture. So here's what's going to happen in the next lecture. I will begin by talking about what Susie Asado might be about, and by giving you some tips and some hints as to how to read difficult literature, particularly poetry, that you might not understand at first glance. Then I'm going to switch topics, and I'm going to read a poem by Langston Hughes called The Negro Speaks of Rivers. But I want to put that in the context of a sub-movement within the broader modernist movement called the Harlem Renaissance, which was a movement within African American culture. And that will lead us into our first novel of the course, which is Quicksand by Nella Larson, because Quicksand is a novel coming out of that Harlem Renaissance movement. So what I would say to do before the next lecture is posted is think about Susie Asado, make sure you've read The Negro Speaks of Rivers, and start reading Quicksand. Read the first couple chapters of Quicksand. I'll probably start talking about it in the next lecture. And then in the meantime, just participate in your discussion section. Do what your TA says to do to participate in that. And I want to thank you very much for your attention to this lecture, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.